Hey guys! Imagine waking before sunrise in ancient Persia, knowing that by nightfall, your entire future could depend on the strangers you meet today. Before that, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comment where you're tuning from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who is joining us from around the world. This is not the glamorous Persia of palace walls and golden treasures. Tonight, we step into the hidden world of an ordinary woman living on the edge of Persian society and follow one quiet, difficult day in her life. So get comfortable, let the room grow quiet, and let's travel back to ancient Persia. Before sunrise, the streets of ancient Persia were quiet. The great cities of the Persian world could appear impressive in historical memory palaces, royal courts, monumental stairways, wealthy merchants, soldiers, gardens, and long roads connecting distant provinces. But most people experienced Persia at a much smaller scale. They experienced it through clay houses, crowded streets, village paths, marketplaces, workshops, wells, cooking fires, and the daily struggle to obtain enough food and money. Among those living on the margins of society were women who earned their living through prostitution. Their lives are difficult to reconstruct. Ancient Persian sources do not provide us with a simple diary describing what a prostitute did from sunrise to sunset. The evidence is scattered, incomplete, and often written from the perspective of governments, religious traditions, wealthy households, or male authors. So the safest way to understand this world is not to imagine one particular woman's story, but to look at the environment around people who worked in this occupation. And that environment began every morning in much the same way as it did for countless other poor people. With darkness. With cold air. With the smell of ashes from yesterday's cooking fire. And with the knowledge that another day of work was about to begin. The houses of ordinary people were generally far removed from the grandeur associated with Persian kings. In towns and villages, many homes were built from mud, brick, or other locally available materials. Rooms could be small, practical, and sparsely furnished. Floors might be covered with woven mats, while clay vessels were used for storing water, grain, oil, and other necessities. There was little unnecessary furniture. For poorer households, every object had a purpose. A damaged vessel was repaired if possible. A torn garment was patched. A broken tool could mean lost income. A shortage of grain could affect the entire household. This was the world in which prostitution existed. It was not separated from the wider economy. It belonged to the same streets, markets, inns, neighborhoods, and systems of exchange that supported countless other occupations. At dawn, the first signs of movement would gradually appear. A door opened. A cooking fire was restarted. Someone carried a vessel toward a water source. Animals stirred. Workers prepared their tools. Farmers and traders began thinking about the day's business. The marketplace would eventually become crowded. And with the marketplace came money. Money was one of the most important forces shaping ancient urban life. People exchanged agricultural produce, textiles, pottery, livestock, tools, food, and services. Some payments were made through coins, while other transactions could involve weighed quantities of precious metals or goods. The Persian Empire itself was enormous, and economic practices differed from one region to another. There was no single experience of poverty. A person living near a royal center could experience a very different world from someone living in a farming village. A woman connected to a wealthy household could have very different circumstances from one living without family support. And a prostitute working in a busy commercial settlement could face circumstances unlike those of someone in a small provincial community. This variety is important. Ancient Persia was not one uniform society. It stretched across an immense territory and included many different peoples, languages, customs, and local traditions. The term Persian itself can therefore hide a great deal of diversity. Yet across these different communities, economic necessity could shape the lives of women. Women worked. Women managed households. Women participated in agricultural production. Women could own or control property in some circumstances. Women could appear in administrative and economic records. And women of lower social status could perform labor that left very little trace in surviving history. Prostitution existed within this broader world of women's economic activity. It should not automatically be imagined as a single organized profession with clearly defined rules. There could have been different circumstances, different forms of work, and different degrees of independence. Some women may have been economically vulnerable. Others may have worked within arrangements controlled by other people. Some may have lived in urban environments where strangers and travelers created demand. Others may have been connected to inns or entertainment establishments. The exact forms varied, and the evidence rarely allows historians to reconstruct them with certainty. What can be understood more clearly is the importance of economic survival. For someone without substantial property, wealth, or family protection, earning money could be essential. Food had to be purchased or obtained. Clothing had to be maintained. Rent or household expenses might need to be covered. Children, relatives, or elderly family members might depend upon an income. Illness could interrupt work. A bad harvest could increase food prices. War could disrupt trade. And political instability could make ordinary life more dangerous. These pressures did not disappear simply because the surrounding civilization was wealthy. Ancient Persia possessed enormous resources. The empire controlled productive agricultural regions, trade routes, wealthy cities, and valuable commodities. But imperial wealth was not distributed equally. A magnificent palace did not mean that everyone living nearby had a comfortable home. A prosperous marketplace did not mean that every worker could afford enough food. And the existence of royal wealth did not remove the vulnerability of people living from one day to the next. This contrast becomes especially important when thinking about prostitution. It is easy to imagine the subject only in terms of sexuality. But for a historical narrator, the more revealing question is often economic. What happened when a person had very few choices for earning money? What happened when social status was low? What happened when protection from family or community was limited? What happened when a person's income depended upon strangers? Those questions bring the subject closer to the realities of ancient life. The morning therefore began not with romance, glamour, or the atmosphere of a palace. It began with ordinary necessities: water, food, clothing, shelter, and money. The streets gradually became louder. As the sun rose higher, shadows moved across the walls. The smell of freshly prepared food began drifting through neighborhoods. Bread was among the most basic foods in many ancient Near Eastern societies, and grain was one of the foundations of everyday life. For people with little money, meals were often simple. There might be bread, grains, dates, onions, legumes, herbs, dairy products, or other locally available foods depending upon region and wealth. Meat was not necessarily an everyday food for the poor. A person's diet depended heavily upon income, season, location, and access to markets. This meant that earning money was not an abstract concern. It could determine what appeared on the table that evening. The same was true of clothing. The wealthy could afford better textiles, elaborate garments, jewelry, and carefully maintained appearances. Poor workers had fewer options. Garments were repaired and reused. Textiles represented valuable labor. Even personal appearance had an economic dimension. Hair, clothing, jewelry, perfume, and cosmetics could communicate social status. Ancient Persian societies, like many ancient societies, placed importance on appearance and social presentation. But appearance did not erase poverty. A carefully maintained garment could still be old. A simple piece of jewelry could represent a person's entire collection of valuables. And a woman could spend time making herself presentable while knowing that she had very little security behind that appearance. By full morning, the quiet streets of dawn had disappeared. The city was awake. The day had become public. And for anyone earning money through prostitution, this was the beginning of the most uncertain part of the day. There were no guarantees. There was no modern employment contract. No fixed wage. No dependable system of social security. Income could vary. Risks could vary. And the ability to refuse unwanted circumstances could depend greatly upon a person's economic position and the people around her. This is one of the reasons prostitution in the ancient world should be understood within the larger history of labor and poverty. It was part of a society where many people had little control over the conditions of their work. Farmers depended upon weather. Laborers depended upon employers. Servants depended upon households. Traders depended upon markets. And people living on the margins depended upon whatever opportunities were available. The sun continued rising over the Persian city. Shops opened. Animals passed through the streets. Merchants arranged their goods. Workers moved toward their tasks. And somewhere within this busy world, women involved in prostitution began another day whose details history has mostly forgotten. Their names have disappeared. Their voices rarely survived. Their private thoughts are almost impossible to recover. But their existence belongs to the larger story of ancient Persian society. And as the morning became brighter, the hidden world of poverty, commerce, and survival was already beginning its daily rhythm. Preparing for the day. By the time the first sunlight reached the upper walls of the city, the stillness of the night had almost disappeared. Ancient Persia was beginning another ordinary morning. In the narrow streets, doors opened slowly. Cooking fires were rekindled. The first sounds of animals came from courtyards and alleys. Somewhere nearby, bread was being prepared. Elsewhere, water was being carried into a household for the day's cooking and washing. For a woman living by prostitution, the morning would begin with many of the same necessities faced by other poor women. There was food to think about. There was clothing to arrange. There was water to obtain. There was a body to wash and prepare. And there was the unavoidable question of money. How much had been earned before? How much remained? And how much would be needed before the next morning arrived? These questions could make even a quiet morning feel uncertain. Food was among the first concerns. The Persian Empire contained regions with very different climates and agricultural traditions, so there was no single diet shared by everyone. The food available to a person depended upon location, season, wealth, and access to markets. For poorer households, however, meals were generally built around practical foods. Grain was fundamental. Bread and other grain-based foods could provide the energy required for a long working day. Dates, onions, legumes, herbs, fruits, dairy products, and other locally available foods could supplement the diet. Meat was available in ancient Persia, but regular access to it depended greatly upon wealth. A royal household could consume foods that would have been far beyond the reach of an ordinary laborer. For someone living close to poverty, food had to be treated carefully. A loaf of bread was not simply breakfast. It represented labor. It represented grain. It represented money. And when money was scarce, wasting food could mean going hungry later. This was one reason poverty was exhausting. It required constant calculation. A person with substantial wealth could purchase something when needed. A poor person often had to think about the next meal before finishing the current one. The same was true of water. Persian civilization became famous for its ability to manage water in difficult environments. Underground channels known as qanats allowed communities in many regions to access groundwater and support agriculture and settlements. But sophisticated water systems did not make water effortless. Someone still had to collect it. Someone still had to carry it. Someone still had to store it. Large clay vessels could hold significant amounts of water, but a full vessel was heavy. For households without servants, water collection could become part of the daily physical labor. The water would be used for drinking, cooking, cleaning, and washing. Personal grooming therefore began with whatever water was available. The ancient Persians, like many ancient peoples, understood the importance of cleanliness and personal presentation. Washing the hands and face could provide relief from dust and heat. Hair could be combed and arranged. Oil could be used on the skin or hair. Fragrant substances and perfumes were known, particularly among wealthier groups. But the difference between rich and poor could be considerable. The wealthy could afford better oils, perfumes, textiles, jewelry, and servants. The poor had to rely upon simpler forms of grooming. For a prostitute, appearance could have an economic importance that was difficult to ignore. The occupation involved meeting other people. It took place within a social world where clothing and grooming could influence first impressions. But there is no evidence for a single special costume that all Persian prostitutes wore. Clothing differed across the empire and across social classes. Women could wear garments made from wool, linen, and other textiles, with different forms of robes, tunics, cloaks, belts, and head coverings appearing in different contexts. The wealthy could afford elaborate textiles and decoration. A poorer woman might own only a few garments. Those garments had to last. A tear could be sewn. A worn section could be patched. Old fabric could be reused. Clothing was valuable because producing textiles required enormous amounts of labor. Before modern machines, every stage of textile production demanded human effort. Fibers had to be prepared. Thread had to be spun. Cloth had to be woven. Garments had to be cut and assembled. For a poor household, replacing clothing was therefore not something done casually. A garment could remain in use for years. It might carry the marks of repeated repairs. And yet it could still be carefully washed and arranged before going outside. That distinction between poverty and neglect is important. Being poor did not mean that a person did not care about appearance. In fact, maintaining personal dignity could become more important when material possessions were limited. A clean garment might be one of the few things a person could control. Hair could be arranged. Hands could be washed. A face could be cleaned. A small amount of oil or fragrance might be used when available. These simple acts could create a sense of order before entering the uncertainty of the street. Ancient societies also attached meaning to appearance. Clothing could indicate social position. Jewelry could communicate wealth. Fine textiles could separate elite households from ordinary workers. A person's appearance could therefore reveal something about their economic circumstances. A prostitute from a poor background would have had difficulty concealing poverty completely. Even carefully maintained clothing could still be simple. Even a small ornament could not create the security that wealth provided. And this was one of the contradictions surrounding the occupation. A person could need to appear presentable while having very little money. A person could earn money without becoming wealthy. A person could be visible without being respected. And a person could attract attention without having real power. The ancient world offered few protections to people living on the margins. There was no modern healthcare system, no guaranteed income, no unemployment insurance, no modern labor regulations. Family and community could provide support, but that support depended upon individual circumstances. A person with strong family connections might have somewhere to turn during illness or financial difficulty. Someone without those connections could be far more vulnerable. For prostitutes, these questions of protection could be particularly important. The historical evidence does not allow us to describe every woman's circumstances. Some may have worked independently. Some may have been connected to establishments or intermediaries. Some may have had greater control over their earnings. Others may have been exploited. The ancient world contained many different arrangements, and historians must be careful not to turn limited evidence into certainty. But one thing is clear. Prostitution existed within the same economic environment as other forms of labor. It involved money. It involved negotiation. It involved unequal social relationships. And for people living close to poverty, the need to earn could be more powerful than concern about social reputation. By late morning, the city would be fully awake. The marketplace would become louder. Merchants would bargain. Travelers would arrive. Workers would carry goods. Animals would move through the streets. The smells of cooking, leather, dust, smoke, and food would fill the air. The private preparations of the morning were over. The public day had begun. And this transition from a small room into the crowded streets was significant. Inside the home, a person could control a small part of the environment. Outside, there were strangers. There were customers. There were merchants. There were officials. There were soldiers. There were other workers. And there were people who might judge, exploit, ignore, or assist. For someone earning a living through prostitution, the uncertainty of the outside world could be especially intense. The day might bring enough income to purchase food. It might bring almost nothing. It might bring a difficult encounter. It might bring danger. It might bring an unexpected opportunity. There was no guarantee. This uncertainty was part of life for many people in the ancient economy, but prostitution placed a woman directly within some of the most complicated relationships between money, gender, and social status. And so, as the sun climbed higher above the Persian city, the morning ended. The food had been eaten. The water had been collected. The clothing had been arranged. The hair had been prepared. The necessities of the household had been dealt with, at least for the moment. Now came the part of the day that could not be prepared for in advance. The work itself. The streets were waiting. The marketplace was alive. And somewhere among the crowds of ancient Persia, another working day was beginning. The road to the marketplace. Streets, merchants, workers, and ordinary Persian life. The morning had fully arrived. The darkness that had covered the Persian city before sunrise had disappeared, replaced by the bright movement of another working day. The streets were no longer quiet. Footsteps passed between the buildings. Animals carried loads through the lanes. Merchants prepared their goods. Workers moved toward workshops and building sites. Farmers and traders entered the city from surrounding settlements. And among all of this ordinary activity, the road toward the marketplace gradually became busier. For anyone earning a living through prostitution, reaching the places where people gathered was an important part of the day's routine. But the journey itself revealed something larger about Persian civilization. The city was not simply a collection of buildings. It was a meeting place for thousands of different lives. A merchant might have arrived carrying goods from another province. A farmer might have brought grain, fruit, animals, or other produce. A craftsman might have spent the morning repairing tools or producing objects for sale. A porter might have carried heavy loads for a few coins. A servant might have been sent to purchase food for a wealthy household. A traveler might have arrived after weeks on the road. The marketplace brought these people together. Ancient Persian cities varied enormously, and not every settlement possessed the same layout or commercial organization. The great imperial centers were different from small provincial towns. A royal capital was different from an agricultural village. A trading settlement near a major road was different from an isolated community. But wherever people gathered to exchange goods and services, there were opportunities for commerce. The streets leading towards such places could be crowded and noisy. Dust rose beneath the feet of people and animals. Donkeys carried baskets. Carts moved slowly when roads allowed them. Vendors called out to customers. Conversations overlapped. The smell of cooked food mixed with animals, smoke, leather, spices, and dust. For a modern traveler, the scene might have felt chaotic. For the people who lived there, it was simply another morning. The marketplace was one of the places where the economic structure of the ancient world became visible. Almost everything had value. Grain had value. Textiles had value. Metal had value. Animals had value. Food had value. Labor had value. And human services had value as well. This was important because prostitution existed within the same economic world. It was not entirely separate from ordinary commerce. People exchanged money or goods for services of many different kinds. Some were skilled. Some were physical. Some were domestic. Some were connected with travel and entertainment. Prostitution belonged to this broader world of paid services, although its social position was much more complicated. The marketplace also provided something else. Information. In a world without newspapers, telephones, or modern mass communication, marketplaces were places where news traveled. Travelers carried stories from distant regions. Merchants discussed prices and political developments. Farmers heard about conditions elsewhere. People learned which roads were safe. They heard about wars, taxes, harvests, and changes in government. A marketplace was therefore more than a place to buy things. It was a social center. And the more people gathered in one place, the more opportunities there were for different kinds of work. This included prostitution. However, it is important not to imagine every Persian marketplace as a place where prostitutes openly stood waiting for customers. The evidence does not support such a simple picture. Different forms of prostitution could have operated in different settings. Some women may have worked independently. Others may have been connected to inns, entertainment establishments, households, or intermediaries. Some encounters may have occurred privately. Others may have been arranged through people who knew both parties. The precise organization remains uncertain. What is clearer is that travelers and urban populations created demand for various forms of accommodation and entertainment. Travel itself was a major feature of Persian imperial life. The empire connected enormous territories. Royal roads and other routes allowed messengers, merchants, officials, soldiers, and travelers to move between regions. Some journeys were long and difficult. Travelers needed food. They needed water. They needed places to sleep. They needed animals cared for. And they needed entertainment. Where people traveled, commercial activity followed. Inns and lodging places could become important centers of urban life. The ancient world did not have hotels in the modern sense, but travelers could find various forms of accommodation. Such places brought strangers together. And where strangers gathered, different kinds of economic relationships could develop. For women living on the margins, these commercial environments could provide opportunities to earn money. But they could also create danger. A crowded marketplace contained people with different levels of wealth and power. A wealthy merchant could afford services that a poor laborer could not. A soldier carried authority and sometimes weapons. An official represented the power of the state. A traveler might possess money but have no local connections. A poor woman might possess neither wealth nor powerful protection. These differences shaped every interaction. Ancient society was deeply hierarchical. People did not enter every transaction as equals. Status mattered. Family mattered. Wealth mattered. Occupation mattered. Connections mattered. Gender mattered. And reputation mattered. This hierarchy could be seen everywhere. The clothing of a wealthy person could differ dramatically from that of a laborer. The quality of food could reveal household income. The size of a home could indicate social position. The people surrounding an individual could reveal their connections. Even the ability to move freely through certain spaces could depend upon status. For a prostitute, these social differences could be particularly significant. The occupation itself could carry stigma. Yet the same society that judged the occupation could also create the economic conditions in which it existed. This contradiction appeared repeatedly throughout the ancient world. People could condemn a profession while continuing to purchase its services. They could look down upon the person performing the work while benefiting from the existence of the work. This did not make the occupation socially accepted. Instead, it placed prostitutes in an uncomfortable position. They could be economically useful while remaining socially marginalized. The marketplace reflected this contradiction. It was a place where people cared about value. But social value and economic value were not the same thing. A person could provide a service that others were willing to pay for and still have low social status. A laborer could be essential to a city and remain poor. A servant could be necessary to a wealthy household and still possess little independence. A prostitute could earn money and still be viewed with suspicion or contempt. This distinction between usefulness and status was central to ancient social life. As the morning continued, the marketplace grew more crowded. Vendors arranged baskets and containers. Food sellers prepared meals. Craftsmen displayed objects they had made. Textile workers handled cloth. Metal workers dealt with tools and weapons. Animal traders negotiated prices. Customers moved between stalls. Coins and other forms of payment changed hands. Arguments broke out and were quickly forgotten. Children watched the adults. Animals became impatient. The city seemed to contain endless movement. For a person walking through this environment, every street could reveal another occupation. A baker working near a small oven. A potter carrying finished vessels. A leatherworker preparing hides. A weaver handling thread. A porter carrying a heavy load. A farmer negotiating the price of produce. A merchant calculating profit. The ancient city depended upon all of them. And yet not all workers received the same rewards. Some occupations were respected. Some were ordinary. Some were looked down upon. Some were associated with poverty. Prostitution belonged among the occupations surrounded by complicated attitudes. The people involved could come from very different circumstances. There was no single story. There was no single level of wealth. There was no single type of customer. There was no single relationship between prostitute and intermediary. History rarely gives us enough information to reconstruct individual experiences. Instead, we see fragments. A record here. A reference there. A legal document. a literary description, an archaeological discovery, a piece of art. Each fragment reveals something, but none tells the entire story. That is why the ordinary street is so important. It reminds us that history was lived by people whose names were never written down. While kings ordered monuments to be built, ordinary workers carried stones. While merchants accumulated wealth, laborers moved their goods. While armies crossed the empire, families waited for them to pass. And while historians later remembered the great rulers of Persia, countless women and men simply woke each morning and went to work. The road toward the marketplace therefore tells us more than the story of one occupation. It reveals the ordinary machinery of Persian life. The economic realities that shaped her profession. The marketplace was now fully awake. What had begun as a quiet collection of streets had become a moving network of people, animals, goods, and money. Every direction offered another transaction. Grain was measured, textiles were examined, animals were negotiated over, food was prepared, and travelers searched for whatever they needed before continuing their journeys. Behind this activity stood a simple reality. People needed money. And in ancient Persia, as in every complex society, the ability to earn money was strongly influenced by social position. A wealthy landowner possessed choices that a poor laborer did not. A merchant with capital could recover from a bad transaction more easily than someone who depended upon a single day's earnings. A household with stored grain could survive a temporary shortage better than a household that purchased food every morning. The difference between having something to fall back on and having nothing could determine the direction of an entire life. For women living through prostitution, economic circumstances could therefore be more important than the occupation itself. It is tempting to imagine prostitution as a completely separate category of ancient life. But it existed inside the same economy as farming, domestic service, weaving, food preparation, entertainment, and other forms of paid labor. The central question was often not simply what work was available. It was what work was available to a particular person. A woman born into a wealthy household could have access to education, property, marriage arrangements, servants, and family protection. A woman born into poverty might have very different possibilities. A woman without parents or relatives could face another set of difficulties. A woman responsible for children could have still more pressure. The ancient world did not provide everyone with the same starting point. Family was one of the most important forms of economic security. A household was not merely a place where people slept. It was an economic unit. Members of a household could farm, weave, prepare food, care for animals, produce textiles, manage storage, and perform countless other tasks. Children could eventually contribute labor. Relatives could provide assistance during illness or hardship. Marriage could connect families and resources. But not everyone had a strong household behind them. Death, divorce, abandonment, conflict, poverty, and other circumstances could weaken those connections. For someone without reliable family support, earning an independent income could become essential. This is one reason prostitution needs to be considered within the broader history of women's labor. Ancient women were not simply confined to one type of activity. Evidence from the Persian world shows women participating in economic life in different ways. Administrative records from the Achaemenid period, particularly those associated with Persepolis, reveal women involved in labor and receiving rations and resources. These records do not describe prostitution directly, but they demonstrate something important. Women were active participants in the economy. They worked. They received compensation in certain contexts. They managed resources. And their labor could be recognized administratively. This broader economic participation helps place prostitution within its historical setting. It was one occupation among many, although one carrying unusual social consequences. For a poor woman, the availability of work could be limited by several factors. Physical strength mattered. Skills mattered. Family connections mattered. Location mattered. Social reputation mattered. And gender mattered. A woman might find work in domestic service, textile production, food preparation, agricultural labor, entertainment, or other activities depending upon circumstances. But these occupations did not necessarily provide equal income. Some required skills or training. Others were poorly paid. Some were seasonal. Some were physically exhausting. Some depended upon finding a wealthy employer. Prostitution could provide money through a different economic mechanism. Instead of producing an object or performing household labor for a fixed employer, income could be obtained from individual transactions. That could potentially provide greater control over timing and earnings in some circumstances. But it could also create instability. There might be no guaranteed income. Customers could vary. Prices could vary. Demand could change. And other people might take part in the arrangement. This meant that the money earned was not necessarily equivalent to personal wealth. A person could handle money without becoming financially secure. If income was spent immediately on food and housing, little could remain. If another person controlled part of the earnings, the amount retained could be even smaller. If debt existed, income could disappear before it ever reached the household. Debt was a serious reality throughout ancient societies. People borrowed for many reasons. A family might need food during a shortage. A farmer might need seed. A merchant might need capital. A household might face an unexpected expense. Borrowing could provide temporary relief, but repayment could create another burden. For someone already living near poverty, debt could become difficult to escape. This was especially dangerous when there were no meaningful savings. One illness could create a new expense. One damaged roof could require repairs. One failed harvest could increase food prices. One death in a household could remove an important source of labor. The ancient economy offered opportunities for wealth, but it also offered many ways for vulnerable people to fall deeper into poverty. For women involved in prostitution, economic vulnerability could create dependence upon others. An intermediary might arrange encounters. A landlord might control housing. A creditor might demand repayment. A powerful customer might possess greater social influence. A relative might depend upon the income. Each relationship could alter the amount of freedom available. This is why the simple idea of choosing a profession can be misleading when applied to ancient poverty. A person could technically choose between several occupations while having no attractive options. Choice existed on a spectrum. The more wealth and protection a person possessed, the more meaningful that choice could become. The fewer resources available, the narrower the range of realistic possibilities. This was true throughout ancient society. A wealthy merchant could decide to abandon one business and start another. A poor laborer might have to accept whatever work appeared that morning. A landowner could survive a failed harvest more easily than a tenant farmer. A person with savings could remain at home during illness. A person without savings might have to work while sick. Economic freedom was therefore closely connected with economic security. The marketplace made these differences visible. Two people could stand beside one another and live in completely different financial worlds. One might carry enough silver to purchase expensive goods. Another might spend the morning calculating whether a small amount of money would cover food. One might travel for business. Another might never leave the neighborhood where they were born. One might possess property. Another might own only clothing and a few household objects. Prostitution existed within this unequal landscape. It could offer money to someone who needed it, but it did not necessarily remove the underlying poverty. In some cases, earnings might improve a person's circumstances. In others, income could disappear almost immediately. There is also an important distinction between urban poverty and rural poverty. The countryside depended heavily upon agriculture. Urban centers offered more opportunities for commerce and wage labor. A city could therefore attract people who had left rural areas in search of work. The presence of travelers and merchants created additional economic activity. This may have made urban environments particularly important for prostitution. Yet city life was expensive. Food had to be purchased more often. Housing could cost money. Competition for work could be intense. And anonymity could provide both opportunity and danger. A person could disappear into a large city more easily than in a small village. That could offer freedom from local judgment. But it could also mean having fewer people to rely upon. The marketplace therefore represented both possibilities. It offered customers. It offered employers. It offered food. It offered information. It offered connections. But it also exposed vulnerable people to strangers. And strangers did not necessarily have the same interests. For prostitution, this unequal environment mattered greatly. The economic transaction might appear simple from the outside. Money was exchanged for a service. But beneath that transaction were questions of power. Who set the terms? Who could refuse? Who controlled the payment? Who provided protection? What happened when an agreement was broken? What happened when someone became violent? What happened when money was withheld? Ancient evidence does not provide complete answers to these questions for Persia. That uncertainty should not be filled with invented details. Instead, it reminds us how difficult it is to recover the experiences of marginalized people. The surviving records were usually created by institutions that cared about administration, taxation, property, religion, law, or royal power. They were not written to preserve the private thoughts of prostitutes. A difficult day at work. Customers, negotiation, money, and social boundaries. By afternoon, the rhythm of the Persian marketplace had changed. The coolness of the morning was gone, and the streets had become warmer, louder, and more crowded. Merchants continued their business. Travelers searched for food and lodging. Workers carried goods through the narrow streets, while customers moved between stalls and workshops. This was the part of the day when commercial activity was most visible. And prostitution, where it existed, belonged to this wider commercial environment. It was a transaction involving people, money, expectations, and social boundaries. But unlike the sale of bread or pottery, the transaction involved a human relationship. That made it more complicated. There was no universal system governing how every encounter took place. Ancient Persian society covered an enormous territory, and customs could differ from one city and period to another. The evidence is too limited to describe a single standard procedure. What can be reconstructed is the broader setting. People who purchased services had money. People who provided services needed income. And between the two stood negotiation. The amount of payment could matter enormously to someone living close to poverty. A small difference in income might determine whether there was enough food for the household. It might determine whether clothing could be repaired. It might determine whether rent or other expenses could be met. Money in the ancient world was never merely an abstract number. It represented bread, oil, clothing, shelter, medicine, travel, and sometimes the ability to survive another week. For this reason, bargaining was part of ordinary economic life. Merchants bargained over goods. Customers negotiated prices. Workers discussed wages. Land could be leased. Animals could be purchased. Services could be paid for. Prostitution existed within this culture of exchange, although the personal and social nature of the transaction made it particularly sensitive. The person offering the service was not simply selling an object. The transaction involved time, privacy, reputation, and personal boundaries. Those boundaries could be difficult to maintain when the two sides possessed unequal power. A wealthy customer could have more money. A soldier could possess physical strength and weapons. An official could possess social authority. A poor woman could possess very little protection. The difference between them could shape the entire encounter. This is one reason the history of prostitution cannot be understood only through prices. The more important question is often who possessed the power to decide the terms. Ancient societies had laws and customs, but legal protection was not necessarily equally accessible to everyone. A person with influential relatives or powerful patrons could have greater support when something went wrong. Someone without such connections could be much more vulnerable. This did not mean that every customer was dangerous or every prostitute was powerless. Human relationships were more complicated than that. There could be regular customers. There could be people who behaved respectfully. There could be arrangements that were relatively stable. There could also be exploitation and violence. The historical evidence simply does not allow every encounter to be placed into one category. What can be said with greater confidence is that social status mattered. Ancient Persian society was hierarchical. People were not treated identically simply because they entered the same marketplace. A wealthy merchant and a poor laborer did not possess the same influence. A noble household and an ordinary family did not have the same resources. A person connected to the administration could move through society differently from someone without connections. And women working in a stigmatized occupation could face judgments that other workers did not. This created a difficult contradiction. The occupation could be economically useful while socially disapproved of. People might pay for a service while simultaneously looking down upon the person providing it. That contradiction was not unique to Persia. Ancient societies often depended upon forms of labor that respectable people preferred not to discuss openly. The people performing those jobs could become socially invisible while their work remained economically important. Prostitutes could occupy precisely such a position. They were visible enough to be approached, yet marginalized enough to be excluded from respectable society. Their income could come from ordinary economic activity, but their occupation could affect how other people treated them. Reputation therefore mattered. A person's reputation could influence marriage prospects, family relationships, housing, employment, and community standing. For someone already living outside conventional expectations, social judgment could create additional difficulties. Women in ancient Persian society could occupy many different positions. Some belonged to wealthy households. Some managed property or resources. Some worked in agriculture or textile production. Some served within households. Some traveled through economic networks connected with trade. And some lived in circumstances that placed them far from the social ideals associated with respectable family life. It would be misleading to imagine a simple division between good women and bad women. Real societies were rarely that simple. A woman's position could change over her lifetime. Marriage could change her household. Widowhood could alter her economic circumstances. Divorce or separation could create new difficulties. Poverty could force difficult decisions. Family support could disappear. Children could create additional responsibilities. Social reputation could change according to circumstances. The occupation of prostitution therefore existed within a larger system of social expectations. Marriage was highly important in ancient societies. Households provided labor, economic support, inheritance, and social continuity. A woman outside marriage could sometimes face greater economic uncertainty. This did not mean every unmarried woman became a prostitute. Far from it. Women could remain unmarried for many different reasons, and prostitution represented only one possible form of economic activity. But marriage and family expectations formed part of the background against which prostitution was judged. This made the marketplace more than a place where money changed hands. It was also a place where social identities became visible. Clothing revealed status. Speech could reveal background. Companions could reveal connections. Occupation could reveal economic position. And reputation could follow a person through the streets. For a prostitute, maintaining some degree of separation between private and public life could be difficult. The occupation depended upon contact with strangers. Yet public exposure could create social consequences. A woman might be recognized. A neighbor might notice. A family member might hear rumors. A future employer might know. The same city that offered anonymity could also spread information quickly. People talked. Merchants talked. Travelers talked. Neighbors talked. And in a society built around households and communities, reputation could travel almost as quickly as money. This made discretion valuable. It also explains why prostitution could exist without necessarily being highly visible in every part of the city. Commercial activity did not always mean public display. Some transactions could be arranged privately. Some could occur through intermediaries. Some could be connected with places where travelers already gathered. Others might have taken place within ordinary residential environments. The precise arrangements remain uncertain. What mattered for the people involved was that the transaction had to be completed. Payment had to be made. Expectations had to be understood. And the day had to continue. For someone dependent upon daily earnings, there was little opportunity to pause and consider the larger historical significance of the work. There was only the immediate calculation. How much money had been earned? How much more was needed? What could be purchased afterward? Could enough be kept aside? Would the household have food tomorrow? These questions gave the occupation its economic reality. The ancient Persian world could be wealthy beyond imagination at the level of empire. But an individual person could still live with constant financial uncertainty. A royal treasury could contain enormous resources while a poor household worried about its next meal. A merchant could transport valuable goods across the empire while a worker struggled to earn enough for the evening. This contrast is essential to understanding everyday life. The existence of imperial wealth did not mean ordinary people experienced prosperity. And the existence of prostitution did not mean everyone involved was participating in luxury. For many people at the economic margins, money earned through work disappeared quickly into necessities. Food consumed it. Housing consumed it. Clothing consumed it. Debt consumed it. Family responsibilities consumed it. Illness could consume everything that remained. As afternoon slowly moved toward evening, the marketplace began to change again. Some merchants prepared to close. Others continued trading. Travelers looked for places to spend the night. The crowds became slightly less concentrated. But the work of the city continued. And within that fading marketplace, the boundaries surrounding prostitution remained complicated. There was money. There was negotiation. The people surrounding the trade and the risks involved. As the afternoon continued, the world surrounding prostitution became just as important as the transaction itself. A prostitute did not necessarily live and work in complete isolation. Ancient urban life depended upon networks of people. Landlords provided rooms. Innkeepers provided accommodation. Merchants brought travelers. Servants moved between households. Officials maintained order. Customers carried money. Neighbors watched what happened around them. And intermediaries, where they existed, could connect people who otherwise might never have met. This meant that prostitution could involve far more people than the two individuals directly participating in a transaction. Yet the exact structure of these relationships in ancient Persia remains difficult to reconstruct. The surviving sources do not provide a complete description of a prostitution industry with clearly defined positions and responsibilities. Instead, historians must work with fragments, references in texts, administrative evidence, legal traditions, archaeological remains, comparisons with neighboring societies. From these pieces, a broader picture can be developed, but many details must remain uncertain. One possibility was the involvement of intermediaries. A person who connected customers with women could potentially control access to money, housing, or clients. Such an arrangement could provide practical advantages. Finding customers could be difficult without connections. A person familiar with travelers or local businesses might know where demand existed. But dependence created another problem. The intermediary could potentially take part of the earnings. The woman performing the work might therefore receive only a portion of the money paid. The more dependent the arrangement, the less control could remain with the person actually performing the service. This was not unique to prostitution. Ancient economies were filled with intermediaries. Merchants depended upon agents. Farmers depended upon buyers. Workers depended upon employers. Travelers depended upon guides. Servants depended upon household heads. Economic relationships frequently involved someone standing between the person producing a service and the person paying for it. But prostitution carried particular vulnerabilities because the work involved personal access and private encounters. The question of protection therefore became important. Who was nearby? Who could intervene if an argument developed? Who would believe the woman if money disappeared? Who could provide help if violence occurred? These questions would have been difficult even in wealthy societies. For someone without family influence, they could be frightening. Ancient cities were not necessarily lawless places. Persian governments maintained systems of administration and authority across a vast empire. Officials collected taxes. Property could be recorded. Contracts could be made. Disputes could be addressed through legal and administrative systems. But the existence of laws did not mean everyone experienced equal protection. Access to authority depended upon circumstances. A person with wealth, family connections, or status could have advantages when dealing with officials. A poor person might have fewer resources. A woman might also face social assumptions that influenced how others viewed her. This does not mean that prostitutes had no legal rights. It means that rights and practical protection were not always the same thing. A law could exist. A contract could exist. A complaint could be made. But enforcing an agreement could be another matter entirely. This distinction is important when thinking about violence. It would be misleading to say that every prostitute in ancient Persia lived under constant attack. There were undoubtedly ordinary transactions that ended without violence. There could have been regular customers. There could have been relationships based on familiarity. There could have been people who respected agreed boundaries. But vulnerability was still present. A customer with greater wealth or physical strength could potentially abuse that advantage. A woman with little support might hesitate to challenge someone more powerful. The threat of violence did not need to happen every day to shape behavior. Simply knowing that it was possible could influence where a person worked, whom they trusted, and how carefully they approached strangers. The same was true of theft. Ancient cities contained thieves and dishonest traders just as cities have throughout history. Money could disappear. Personal belongings could be stolen. A person might be deceived about payment. A transaction could become an argument. The risks were not unique to prostitution, but the private nature of the work could make certain disputes more difficult to resolve. There was also the danger of illness. Ancient people had medical knowledge, but they did not possess modern understanding of infectious disease. They lacked antibiotics. They lacked modern diagnostic tools. They lacked many of the protective measures now considered ordinary. Illness could therefore have serious economic consequences. For a person dependent upon daily income, becoming sick was not simply a health problem. It was a financial problem. If work stopped, income stopped. If income stopped, food and housing could become uncertain. A serious illness could therefore create a downward spiral. This was one reason poverty could be so difficult to escape. A person needed money to remain healthy. But a person needed health to earn money. Breaking that cycle was difficult. The risks of pregnancy also belong to the wider reality of women's lives. Ancient societies lacked modern reproductive health care. Pregnancy and childbirth could be dangerous. Women had knowledge of herbs, medicines, birth practices, and traditional forms of care, but the risks remained considerable. For a prostitute, pregnancy could create additional economic and social complications. A pregnancy might interrupt work. A child would require food and care. Social judgment could increase. And without a supportive household, the burden could become overwhelming. Yet it would be wrong to assume that every prostitute was unmarried or childless. Women in the ancient world could experience marriage, motherhood, widowhood, separation, and other family circumstances. Their working lives could change accordingly. Some may have supported children. Some may have worked temporarily. Some may have remained in the occupation for longer periods. The historical evidence does not allow us to know how common each situation was. This uncertainty is part of the story. The ancient world left behind impressive monuments, but it did not leave detailed biographies of ordinary marginalized women. The absence of evidence can make their lives seem invisible. But invisibility in the historical record does not mean insignificance in real life. Every transaction required two people. Every household required food. Every city required workers. Every traveler depended upon services. And every person living at the bottom of society had to make decisions about survival. The people surrounding prostitution therefore formed a complicated network. Some could help. Some could profit. Some could exploit. Some could simply ignore what was happening. A landlord might care only about rent. An innkeeper might care only about business. A customer might care only about the service purchased. A neighbor might care about reputation. An official might care about maintaining order. A relative might care about survival. Each person could see the same woman differently. To one, she was a customer. To another, a tenant. To another, a source of income. To another, a social embarrassment. To another, simply a neighbor. This difference in perspective could shape the life of someone working in a stigmatized occupation. Social judgment could be as powerful as economic pressure. A woman known to be involved in prostitution might find respectable employment more difficult to obtain. Marriage prospects could be affected. Family relationships could become strained. Neighbors might gossip. Relatives might distance themselves. But stigma could also be complicated. Ancient societies often tolerated activities they publicly criticized. People could condemn prostitution while continuing to purchase sexual services. They could criticize certain occupations while depending upon the people who performed them. The contradiction was built into the social structure. The occupation could be both present and disapproved of. Visible and hidden. Commercial and stigmatized. And this tension could make daily life psychologically difficult even when the historical record cannot reveal individual emotions. As the sun began to descend, the marketplace slowly changed. The strongest heat of the day began to fade. Shadows lengthened along the walls. Merchants started gathering their goods. Animals became restless after hours in the crowded streets. Travelers searched for places to spend the night. The city was moving toward evening. For a prostitute, the end of the working day did not necessarily mean the end of uncertainty. Money had to be counted. Food had to be considered. A safe place to sleep had to be maintained. And tomorrow was already approaching. Whatever had happened during the day would have consequences for the next one. A profitable day might bring temporary relief. A poor day could create anxiety. A dangerous encounter could leave physical or emotional consequences. A disagreement over payment could turn a seemingly ordinary transaction into a serious problem. Yet life continued. Women, marriage, and reputation. Respectable women and marginalized women. As evening settled over the Persian city, the noise of the marketplace gradually softened. But the social world of ancient Persia did not become simpler when the shops closed. Behind the walls of ordinary homes, families continued their routines. Food was prepared. Children were gathered inside. Lamps were lit. Conversations continued in courtyards and rooms. For most people, identity was closely connected to the household. A person's family could influence where they lived, whom they married, what work they performed, and how other people regarded them. For women especially, family and reputation could shape the boundaries of everyday life. Ancient Persian society was not one uniform system, and the position of women varied according to period, region, class, and individual circumstances. The Persian Empire included many different peoples and traditions. A woman living in a wealthy urban household did not necessarily experience the same expectations as a woman working in agriculture. A woman connected to the royal court occupied a very different position from a poor laborer. And a woman living independently could face circumstances unlike those of a married woman supported by a large family. Yet across these differences, the household remained extremely important. Marriage was not simply a private relationship between two individuals. It could connect families. It could create economic partnerships. It could establish responsibilities between relatives. It could provide a framework for children, inheritance, and property. For this reason, the reputation of a woman could matter greatly to the household surrounding her. This helps explain the sharp social distinction that could exist between women regarded as respectable and women living outside accepted expectations. But the distinction was never as simple as modern stereotypes sometimes suggest. Ancient Persian women were not all confined to their homes. Evidence from the Achaemenid period shows women participating in economic activity and appearing in administrative records. Women could receive rations, perform labor, and in some circumstances possess or manage economic resources. This is particularly visible in the Persepolis administrative archives, which record people receiving goods and provisions. Such records remind us that women were active participants in the functioning of the empire. They were workers. They were household managers. They were producers. They were consumers. They could have economic responsibilities that extended far beyond the private home. At the same time, social expectations surrounding marriage and family remained powerful. A woman's reputation could influence how others treated her. This was especially significant because ancient communities were often closely connected. People knew their neighbors. Families knew one another. Business relationships could continue for generations. Marriage could link households that already had economic or social connections. In such an environment, reputation was a form of social capital. A respected family could benefit from trust. A damaged reputation could create difficulties. For a woman involved in prostitution, this created a difficult position. The occupation could provide an income while simultaneously placing a person outside the ideals associated with respectable family life. This did not necessarily mean that every prostitute was completely rejected by society. Ancient communities were complicated. A woman could have relatives who continued to support her. Neighbors could know her circumstances without necessarily abandoning her. A person might move between different social circles. And the degree of stigma could vary according to place and circumstance. But prostitution could still carry a reputation that separated it from many other forms of women's work. The difference becomes clearer when comparing occupations. A woman producing textiles might contribute to the household economy while remaining within an accepted social role. A woman working in agriculture could perform difficult physical labor without necessarily being considered socially disreputable. A woman selling food could participate openly in marketplace activity. But prostitution involved sexual relationships outside the framework that many societies associated with marriage and family. That difference could create moral judgment. The ancient world had its own ideas about sexuality, marriage, fidelity, and social order. Those ideas were not identical to modern ones. It is therefore dangerous to project modern moral categories backward without examination. Ancient Persian society had traditions and expectations that developed within its own historical context. Religious beliefs could influence ideas about purity, family, marriage, and proper conduct. Legal customs could regulate property, contracts, and family relationships. Social traditions could determine what behavior was considered honorable or shameful. But none of these systems operated in exactly the same way for every person. The wealthy had resources that could soften social consequences. The poor often had fewer choices. This distinction is essential. A wealthy woman who experienced a family dispute could potentially rely upon relatives, property, or household servants. A poor woman might have no such protection. A woman with property could have greater independence. A woman without property could be dependent upon others. A woman with children and family support could have one form of security. A woman alone in a city could have another. The same occupation could therefore produce very different experiences. This is why it is difficult to describe prostitution simply as either freedom or oppression. Neither word captures the full complexity. Earning money could provide a degree of independence. But dependence upon customers could create vulnerability. Working outside a household could offer freedom from one employer. But it could also remove the protection of family networks. A woman might control some of her income while remaining socially marginalized. She might have more economic independence than another poor woman while having less social respect. The ancient world contained many such contradictions. Reputation was especially important because it could influence future opportunities. Marriage was one of those opportunities. In a society where marriage connected households and created economic relationships, a woman's perceived sexual reputation could matter. This does not mean every woman involved in prostitution was permanently excluded from marriage. Historical evidence is too limited to make such a claim. People's lives changed. Circumstances changed. A person could leave an occupation. A widow could remarry. A woman could move to another community. A family could accept circumstances that outsiders did not. But the possibility of stigma remained. And stigma could travel. In a small community, a person's reputation might be known widely. In a large city, anonymity could provide some protection. A newcomer might not know the local history of every resident. A person could potentially build a new life among strangers. Yet the same anonymity could create danger. Without relatives nearby, there might be nobody to defend a person's reputation or safety. This was one of the paradoxes of urban life. The city could offer freedom from constant observation. But it could also leave people isolated. For prostitution, that isolation could be particularly significant. A woman working in a large city might encounter customers from many different backgrounds. Travelers might come from distant parts of the empire. Merchants might speak different languages. Soldiers might pass through. Officials might arrive on administrative business. The city brought all of them together. And with them came money. But money did not erase social boundaries. A wealthy customer and a poor prostitute remained unequal in status even during a transaction. A person could purchase a service without granting the provider social equality. This distinction between economic exchange and social status was common throughout ancient life. A servant could be paid while remaining socially inferior to the person employing them. A laborer could be essential to a building project without gaining prestige. A craftsman could produce valuable goods without becoming wealthy. A prostitute could earn money without becoming respectable in the eyes of the community. The ancient economy depended upon countless people whose social position remained low. This was not unique to Persia. But Persia, like other large ancient civilizations, developed complex hierarchies that shaped everyday relationships. At the top were royal and aristocratic circles. Below them were officials, landowners, merchants, soldiers, craftsmen, farmers, laborers, servants, and many others. The boundaries were not always fixed. People could become wealthier. Families could rise. Individuals could lose property. Military service could change status. Trade could create new fortunes. But inequality remained a central feature of society. For women living through prostitution, economic position and gender could therefore overlap. Being poor was one disadvantage. Being a woman could create additional restrictions. Being associated with a stigmatized occupation could create another. The combination could make life particularly uncertain. Yet the same woman could possess abilities, intelligence, relationships, and forms of independence that the historical record simply does not reveal. This is where the silence of history becomes important. Ancient records rarely describe marginalized women in their own voices. Marriage, family, loneliness, and social judgment. Night had settled over the Persian city. Behind closed doors, families gathered around evening meals. Lamps burned in homes and courtyards. Conversations became quieter as the day's work came to an end. For many people, the household was the center of life. It was where food was stored, where children grew up, where property was managed, where family decisions were made, and where a person's social identity was often understood. Marriage therefore had an importance that extended far beyond companionship. In ancient Persian society, marriage could connect families, establish economic relationships, provide a recognized setting for children, and create obligations between relatives. The household was an economic institution as much as a private one. Everyone could contribute in different ways. Men might work in agriculture, trade, administration, crafts, or military service. Women could manage household production, prepare food, produce textiles, participate in agricultural work, and contribute to economic activities outside the home. Children eventually became part of the household labor force as well. For this reason, family could provide a form of security. A person with relatives nearby was not necessarily protected from poverty, but there could be someone to turn to during difficult times. Food might be shared. A place to sleep might be available. Children could be cared for. Work could be found through family connections. Information could be exchanged. In an ancient world without modern social services, these relationships mattered enormously. But not everyone had a strong family network. People died. Families separated. Wars disrupted communities. Economic hardship forced migration. Marriage could end. Children could be left without one or both parents. And some people simply lived far from the families into which they had been born. For a woman involved in prostitution, the question of family could therefore be complicated. Some may have had families of their own. Some may have been married. Some may have been widowed. Some may have had children. Some may have lived with relatives. Others may have lived without close family support. There is no reliable evidence that allows historians to assign one situation to all prostitutes in ancient Persia. Their lives were as varied as the wider population. But whatever the circumstances, family could influence economic choices. A woman supporting children would have different pressures from a woman responsible only for herself. A widow without property might face very different choices from a widow supported by wealthy relatives. A married woman might have access to household resources that an unmarried woman lacked. A woman separated from her family might depend upon paid work. These differences could determine how urgently income was needed. Poverty rarely arrived alone. It could bring hunger, debt, poor housing, illness, and social insecurity with it. A woman who needed money for herself might already be dealing with several other problems. If children were involved, the pressure could increase. Food had to be provided. Clothing had to be repaired. Illness had to be managed. And a child could not simply be told that there was no money. The ancient world had no modern system of child support or universal assistance. Family networks were therefore crucial. But family networks could also become sources of judgment. A woman whose occupation brought shame upon a household could create conflict with relatives. Ancient societies cared deeply about reputation. A family's standing could affect marriage arrangements, business relationships, and social connections. A person's actions could therefore be understood as reflecting upon relatives. This could make prostitution particularly difficult to reconcile with conventional expectations. The occupation might provide money for a household while simultaneously damaging the family's reputation. That contradiction could create tension. The money could be needed. The occupation could still be condemned. And the people benefiting from the income might not openly acknowledge where it came from. This kind of contradiction is common throughout human history. Societies sometimes depend upon work that they publicly stigmatize. The work continues because there is demand. But the workers are pushed toward the margins. They become useful but not respectable. Visible but not fully accepted. Ancient prostitution could exist within this uncomfortable space. Marriage created another set of difficulties. The social expectations surrounding marriage were not identical for every class or community, but marriage was generally an important institution. It helped establish legitimate family relationships and inheritance. For women, reputation could therefore influence the opportunities available for forming a household. A woman associated with prostitution might face greater difficulty finding a partner willing to accept the social consequences. But again, the evidence does not justify saying that marriage was impossible. Human relationships did not always follow social ideals. People formed attachments. Circumstances changed. Individuals made decisions that families did not always approve of. A person could move to another community. A family could accept a difficult past. And someone could leave one occupation and begin another. History does not provide enough evidence to know how often these things happened. The emotional consequences are equally difficult to recover. Ancient sources rarely preserve the private feelings of poor women. There are no surviving diaries describing the loneliness of a prostitute in an ordinary Persian town. There are no personal letters that allow historians to reconstruct an entire emotional life. What remains are fragments. Yet loneliness itself is not difficult to understand as a human possibility. A person surrounded by customers can still be alone. A person living in a crowded city can still lack family. A person earning money can still lack security. And a person surrounded by people can still have nobody to trust. Urban life could create exactly this contradiction. The city offered anonymity. Anonymity could be useful. It allowed people to escape the constant observation of small communities. A newcomer could arrive without everyone knowing their history. But anonymity also removed familiar support. There might be no parent nearby. No sibling. No childhood friend. No relative to intervene when something went wrong. The same crowded streets that offered opportunity could therefore produce isolation. For someone living through prostitution, trust could become especially valuable. Not necessarily romantic trust. Simple practical trust. Knowing who could be relied upon. Knowing which customer was safe. Knowing where to obtain food. Knowing which landlord was reasonable. Knowing whom to approach when money disappeared. Knowing which streets were safer at night. In a world without modern communication, such knowledge was learned through experience and through other people. Reputation worked in both directions. A prostitute might be judged by customers and neighbors. But customers and intermediaries could also develop reputations. People learned whom to avoid, whom to trust, whom to bargain with, and whom to fear. This created an informal network of information within the city. Yet information could also become gossip. A woman's reputation could spread beyond her control. A neighbor might talk. A customer might boast. A relative might hear a rumor. A future employer might learn about the past. This could make changing one's life difficult. The stigma attached to prostitution was therefore not simply a matter of insults. It could affect practical opportunities. Finding another occupation could become harder. Entering a respectable household could become more complicated. Marriage negotiations could be affected. Family relationships could become strained. And the person might carry a reputation long after circumstances had changed. Still, it would be wrong to imagine every ancient Persian community as uniformly hostile. Different places had different customs. Different people had different attitudes. Some might condemn prostitution strongly. Others might tolerate it quietly. Some might care only about whether money was paid and public order was maintained. Some families might be supportive. Others might reject a relative completely. There was no single Persian response. This diversity is one of the most important facts about ancient civilization. The Persian Empire was enormous. Its population included many cultures. Local customs survived alongside imperial administration. Religious traditions varied. Economic conditions differed. And everyday life depended heavily upon where a person lived. The experience of a prostitute in a major commercial center could therefore differ greatly from that of someone in a small provincial settlement. Yet the underlying tension remained. The need to earn money existed alongside expectations surrounding marriage, family, and respectability. A woman could be economically independent in one sense and socially vulnerable in another. She could support herself while being judged. She could support a family while being rejected by respectable society. She could have customers without having friends. She could earn money without accumulating wealth. And she could live among thousands of people without feeling that she belonged to any of them. These contradictions make the history of prostitution more complicated than simple stories of victimhood or freedom. The reality was likely a mixture of necessity, adaptation, survive. The shadow behind the money. Poverty, debt, illness, and exploitation. By the time the city had fallen quiet, the sounds of the marketplace had almost disappeared. The merchants had closed their stalls. The animals had been taken indoors or settled into their enclosures. Cooking fires burned behind walls, and the streets that had been crowded during the afternoon were becoming still. Yet for people living close to poverty, nighttime did not necessarily bring peace. Money earned during the day had to be considered carefully. How much remained? How much had already been spent? Would there be enough food for tomorrow? Could a damaged garment be repaired? Could a debt be reduced? Could illness be treated if it appeared? These questions belong to the ordinary reality of ancient economic life. For a prostitute, the money earned from a day's work could provide immediate relief, but it did not automatically create security. The difference between income and wealth was enormous. A person might earn money regularly and still possess almost nothing. If most of the income disappeared into food, shelter, clothing, debt, or family responsibilities, there would be little left to save. This was one of the great dangers of poverty. Poverty was not simply having less. It was having almost nothing between a person and disaster. A wealthy household could survive an unexpected expense. A poor household might not. If a roof needed repair, someone with savings could pay for the work. Someone without savings might have to borrow. If food prices increased, a wealthy family could change what it purchased or draw upon stored supplies. A poor household might simply eat less. If illness appeared, a wealthy person could seek better treatment. A poor worker might continue working because stopping meant losing income. The ancient world therefore contained a constant tension between earning money and remaining healthy enough to earn it. For anyone dependent upon daily work, illness was especially dangerous. Ancient Persian society possessed medical knowledge. People used herbs, preparations, dietary practices, and other forms of treatment. Skilled healers existed. But medicine had severe limitations compared with modern healthcare. There were no antibiotics. There were no modern hospitals in the contemporary sense. There were no advanced diagnostic machines. Many infections and injuries could become serious. Even an ordinary illness could interrupt work. For a person earning money through prostitution, an illness could have several consequences at once. Work could stop. Income could disappear. Food could become harder to purchase. Debt could increase. And if the illness affected appearance or physical ability, returning to work could become even more difficult. This created a cycle. Health was needed to work. Work was needed to afford food and care. Food and care were needed to maintain health. Breaking the cycle required support. Family could provide it. Friends could provide it. An employer could sometimes provide it. But someone without such support faced greater vulnerability. Debt created another danger. Borrowing was a normal part of ancient economies. Farmers sometimes needed credit. Merchants needed capital. Households could borrow during difficult periods. But debt could become oppressive when income was unstable. A person who borrowed money to survive one difficult period might discover that the next period was no better. Interest, repayment obligations, or other conditions could increase the burden. The exact legal and economic arrangements varied across time and place, so it is impossible to describe one universal Persian debt system. But the general problem was familiar across ancient civilizations. Borrowing could provide temporary survival while creating long-term dependence. For someone working in prostitution, debt might arise from ordinary household needs. Food, housing, clothing, family expenses, travel, medical treatment. There was nothing unusual about needing money for these things. What made poverty dangerous was the absence of reserves. A small debt could become a large problem if earnings suddenly fell. Exploitation could then become easier. Whenever one person possessed money and another desperately needed it, an imbalance could appear. A landlord could demand payment. A creditor could insist on repayment. An intermediary could control access to customers. A customer could attempt to reduce payment after an agreement. A person with more power could use that advantage. These possibilities existed in many ancient occupations, but prostitution created particular vulnerabilities because the work involved intimate encounters and could be socially stigmatized. Exploitation did not always have to look dramatic. Sometimes it could be simple dependence. A person might remain with an intermediary because finding customers alone was difficult. A worker might remain in an arrangement because leaving would mean losing housing. A poor woman might accept unfair terms because the alternative was hunger. This is how economic pressure can reduce practical freedom. A choice can exist on paper while becoming nearly impossible in reality. There might technically be another occupation, but perhaps it paid much less. Perhaps it required skills that were unavailable. Perhaps it required leaving the city. Perhaps it required family support. Perhaps the person needed money immediately. Under such circumstances, the available alternatives became narrower. This is why poverty is best understood not merely as a shortage of money, but as a shortage of choices. The ancient Persian Empire contained enormous wealth. Royal palaces displayed valuable materials. Elite households possessed fine textiles, jewelry, servants, animals, and imported goods. Long-distance trade connected distant regions. Agriculture supported large populations. Administrative systems organized resources across the empire. But imperial wealth did not reach every individual equally. A person could live inside one of the greatest empires of the ancient world and still struggle to afford food. This contrast is one of the most striking features of ancient history. The same civilization that could construct monumental architecture depended upon people whose daily lives were physically exhausting. The same empire that moved luxury goods across thousands of kilometers contained households with very few possessions. And the same cities where wealthy merchants negotiated profitable deals contained workers who lived from one payment to the next. Prostitution existed inside this inequality. Some customers may have been travelers with disposable income. Some may have been merchants. Some may have been soldiers. Some may have been local workers. The income available therefore depended upon the economic environment surrounding the city. A prosperous commercial center could provide more opportunities. A poor settlement could provide fewer. During difficult economic periods, demand could change. During prosperous periods, it might increase. This uncertainty made planning difficult. A prostitute could not necessarily know how much would be earned tomorrow. And without predictable income, saving became difficult. Savings were one of the most important protections against disaster. Even a small reserve could help during illness or unemployment. But saving required earning more than was needed immediately. For someone already poor, that could be nearly impossible. Food came first. Shelter came next. Debt demanded attention. Family needs could not simply be postponed. This meant that money could pass through a person's hands without ever becoming lasting security. The evening meal might consume part of it. A landlord might receive another portion. A creditor might claim another. A family member might need help. By morning, very little could remain. Then the cycle began again. This repeated cycle could be exhausting. Not only physically, but mentally. Every day contained another calculation. Every unexpected event mattered. A broken sandal could become a problem. A damaged garment could become a problem. A sick child could become a crisis. A missed customer could mean less food. A dishonest payment could create an immediate shortage. The ancient world offered few ways to absorb these shocks. There were charitable traditions and community networks in various societies, but assistance could never be assumed. Family remained the most important source of support for many people. Without it, survival could become much harder. This was particularly significant for women living outside conventional household structures. A woman without a husband, parents, adult children, or supportive relatives might need to rely upon her own income. That could provide a degree of independence. But independence without resources could be fragile. The ability to earn money was valuable. The ability to keep money was even more valuable. And the ability to survive without working for a short period could be the greatest security of all. For a poor prostitute, that final form of security might be difficult to obtain. The occupation could therefore become part of a cycle in which money arrived and disappeared, again and again. Morning brought the need to earn. Afternoon brought transactions. Evening brought expenses. Night brought uncertainty. Then morning came again. Behind the apparent simplicity of earning money was a complicated economic reality. There was poverty. There was debt. There was illness. There was dependence. And where dependence became severe, exploitation could follow. The ancient Persian world was capable of extraordinary organization and wealth, but it could not remove the vulnerability that came with being poor. The shadow behind the money. Poverty, debt, illness, and exploitation. By the time the city had fallen quiet, the sounds of the marketplace had almost disappeared. The merchants had closed their stalls. The animals had been taken indoors or settled into their enclosures. Cooking fires burned behind walls, and the streets that had been crowded during the afternoon were becoming still. Yet for people living close to poverty, nighttime did not necessarily bring peace. Money earned during the day had to be considered carefully. How much remained? How much had already been spent? Would there be enough food for tomorrow? Could a damaged garment be repaired? Could a debt be reduced? Could illness be treated if it appeared? These questions belong to the ordinary reality of ancient economic life. For a prostitute, the money earned from a day's work could provide immediate relief, but it did not automatically create security. The difference between income and wealth was enormous. A person might earn money regularly and still possess almost nothing. If most of the income disappeared into food, shelter, clothing, debt, or family responsibilities, there would be little left to save. This was one of the great dangers of poverty. Poverty was not simply having less. It was having almost nothing between a person and disaster. A wealthy household could survive an unexpected expense. A poor household might not. If a roof needed repair, someone with savings could pay for the work. Someone without savings might have to borrow. If food prices increased, a wealthy family could change what it purchased or draw upon stored supplies. A poor household might simply eat less. If illness appeared, a wealthy person could seek better treatment. A poor worker might continue working because stopping meant losing income. The ancient world therefore contained a constant tension between earning money and remaining healthy enough to earn it. For anyone dependent upon daily work, illness was especially dangerous. Ancient Persian society possessed medical knowledge. People used herbs, preparations, dietary practices, and other forms of treatment. Skilled healers existed. But medicine had severe limitations compared with modern healthcare. There were no antibiotics. There were no modern hospitals in the contemporary sense. There were no advanced diagnostic machines. Many infections and injuries could become serious. Even an ordinary illness could interrupt work. For a person earning money through prostitution, an illness could have several consequences at once. Work could stop. Income could disappear. Food could become harder to purchase. Debt could increase. And if the illness affected appearance or physical ability, returning to work could become even more difficult. This created a cycle. Health was needed to work. Work was needed to afford food and care. Food and care were needed to maintain health. Breaking the cycle required support. Family could provide it. Friends could provide it. An employer could sometimes provide it. But someone without such support faced greater vulnerability. Debt created another danger. Borrowing was a normal part of ancient economies. Farmers sometimes needed credit. Merchants needed capital. Households could borrow during difficult periods. But debt could become oppressive when income was unstable. A person who borrowed money to survive one difficult period might discover that the next period was no better. Interest, repayment obligations, or other conditions could increase the burden. The exact legal and economic arrangements varied across time and place, so it is impossible to describe one universal Persian debt system. But the general problem was familiar across ancient civilizations. Borrowing could provide temporary survival while creating long-term dependence. For someone working in prostitution, debt might arise from ordinary household needs. Food, housing, clothing, family expenses, travel, medical treatment. There was nothing unusual about needing money for these things. What made poverty dangerous was the absence of reserves. A small debt could become a large problem if earnings suddenly fell. Exploitation could then become easier. Whenever one person possessed money and another desperately needed it, an imbalance could appear. A landlord could demand payment. A creditor could insist on repayment. An intermediary could control access to customers. A customer could attempt to reduce payment after an agreement. A person with more power could use that advantage. These possibilities existed in many ancient occupations, but prostitution created particular vulnerabilities because the work involved intimate encounters and could be socially stigmatized. Exploitation did not always have to look dramatic. Sometimes it could be simple dependence. A person might remain with an intermediary because finding customers alone was difficult. A worker might remain in an arrangement because leaving would mean losing housing. A poor woman might accept unfair terms because the alternative was hunger. This is how economic pressure can reduce practical freedom. A choice can exist on paper while becoming nearly impossible in reality. There might technically be another occupation, but perhaps it paid much less. Perhaps it required skills that were unavailable. Perhaps it required leaving the city. Perhaps it required family support. Perhaps the person needed money immediately. Under such circumstances, the available alternatives became narrower. This is why poverty is best understood not merely as a shortage of money, but as a shortage of choices. The ancient Persian Empire contained enormous wealth. Royal palaces displayed valuable materials. Elite households possessed fine textiles, jewelry, servants, animals, and imported goods. Long-distance trade connected distant regions. Agriculture supported large populations. Administrative systems organized resources across the empire. But imperial wealth did not reach every individual equally. A person could live inside one of the greatest empires of the ancient world and still struggle to afford food. This contrast is one of the most striking features of ancient history. The same civilization that could construct monumental architecture depended upon people whose daily lives were physically exhausting. The same empire that moved luxury goods across thousands of kilometers contained households with very few possessions. And the same cities where wealthy merchants negotiated profitable deals contained workers who lived from one payment to the next. Prostitution existed inside this inequality. Some customers may have been travelers with disposable income. Some may have been merchants. Some may have been soldiers. Some may have been local workers. The income available therefore depended upon the economic environment surrounding the city. A prosperous commercial center could provide more opportunities. A poor settlement could provide fewer. During difficult economic periods, demand could change. During prosperous periods, it might increase. This uncertainty made planning difficult. A prostitute could not necessarily know how much would be earned tomorrow. And without predictable income, saving became difficult. Savings were one of the most important protections against disaster. Even a small reserve could help during illness or unemployment. But saving required earning more than was needed immediately. For someone already poor, that could be nearly impossible. Food came first. Shelter came next. Debt demanded attention. Family needs could not simply be postponed. This meant that money could pass through a person's hands without ever becoming lasting security. The evening meal might consume part of it. A landlord might receive another portion. A creditor might claim another. A family member might need help. By morning, very little could remain. Then the cycle began again. This repeated cycle could be exhausting. Not only physically, but mentally. Every day contained another calculation. Every unexpected event mattered. A broken sandal could become a problem. A damaged garment could become a problem. A sick child could become a crisis. A missed customer could mean less food. A dishonest payment could create an immediate shortage. The ancient world offered few ways to absorb these shocks. There were charitable traditions and community networks in various societies, but assistance could never be assumed. Family remained the most important source of support for many people. Without it, survival could become much harder. This was particularly significant for women living outside conventional household structures. A woman without a husband, parents, adult children, or supportive relatives might need to rely upon her own income. That could provide a degree of independence. But independence without resources could be fragile. The ability to earn money was valuable. The ability to keep money was even more valuable. And the ability to survive without working for a short period could be the greatest security of all. For a poor prostitute, that final form of security might be difficult to obtain. The occupation could therefore become part of a cycle in which money arrived and disappeared, again and again. Morning brought the need to earn. Afternoon brought transactions. Evening brought expenses. Night brought uncertainty. Then morning came again. Behind the apparent simplicity of earning money was a complicated economic reality. There was poverty. There was debt. There was illness. There was dependence. And where dependence became severe, exploitation could follow. The ancient Persian world was capable of extraordinary organization and wealth, but it could not remove the vulnerability that came with being poor. protection, danger, and the uncertain power of the law. The streets were quieter now. Most of the day's business had ended, but the problems created during the day did not disappear with the closing of the marketplace. For a person living close to poverty, protection was never something that could simply be taken for granted. Protection could come from family. It could come from neighbors. It could come from an employer or patron. It could come from community relationships. And, in principle, it could come from the authorities. Ancient Persian governments maintained extensive systems of administration. The Achaemenid Empire, in particular, was capable of recording transactions, distributing resources, collecting taxes, managing territories, and communicating across enormous distances. Officials had responsibilities. Courts and legal traditions existed. Contracts could be written. Property could be transferred. Disputes could be recorded. But the existence of administration did not mean that every ordinary person experienced the law in the same way. Law was one thing. Access to law was another. A wealthy person could possess the resources necessary to pursue a dispute. A poor person might not. A powerful family could have connections. A person living alone might have very few. A person with written documentation could sometimes establish a claim more easily than someone whose agreement depended entirely upon spoken promises. And a person with witnesses could have an advantage over someone without them. This was the complicated world in which vulnerable workers lived. For a prostitute, the question of protection could be especially difficult. The occupation itself might be tolerated in certain circumstances while still carrying social stigma. If a disagreement occurred with a customer, intermediary, landlord, or another person, the prostitute could not necessarily rely upon automatic sympathy. Social reputation could influence how others viewed the dispute. This does not mean that prostitutes had no legal standing. Such a conclusion would go beyond the evidence. Women in the Persian world could participate in economic transactions, possess resources in certain circumstances, and appear in administrative records. The evidence from Persepolis, for example, demonstrates that women could be recognized as economic participants within the imperial system. But legal and administrative participation did not eliminate vulnerability. A person could possess rights and still struggle to enforce them. That distinction mattered enormously. Imagine a dispute over money. The agreement might be clear to the people involved. Payment might have been promised. But if the customer refused to pay, what could happen? The answer would depend upon the circumstances. Was there a witness? Was there a written agreement? Was the person known? Was there a local authority capable of intervening? Did the woman have someone willing to support her claim? These details could make a difference. Unfortunately, the historical record does not provide enough evidence to reconstruct a standard procedure for every prostitution-related dispute in ancient Persia. It is safer to understand the broader legal environment rather than inventing a specific system. What is clear is that ancient Persian administration was not absent. The empire depended upon records and officials. Economic activity was monitored. People entered contracts. Property and obligations mattered. The state had an interest in maintaining order because disorder interfered with taxation, trade, and administration. But the poorest members of society could still be exposed to danger. This was true for many workers. A laborer could be cheated. A servant could be mistreated. A farmer could lose a crop. A traveler could be robbed. A woman could face violence. The ancient world lacked many of the institutions that modern people rely upon. There were no emergency services to call immediately. No modern shelters. No standardized social welfare system. No widespread access to professional legal assistance. No modern concept of workplace safety. Protection often depended upon relationships. Knowing the right person could matter. Having family nearby could matter. Living in a stable neighborhood could matter. Being connected to a powerful household could matter. For someone on the margins, these forms of social capital could be limited. That made danger more serious. Violence was not inevitable. But the possibility of violence could never be ignored. A customer might become aggressive. A dispute could escalate. A stranger might steal. An intermediary could become abusive. A landlord could exploit dependents. These risks were not necessarily constant, but they existed within the background of daily life. The same marketplace that created opportunities could also create vulnerability. Crowds could provide anonymity. Anonymity could be useful, but it could also make it harder to know whom to trust. A stranger could arrive carrying money and leave before anyone knew who they were. Travelers moved through cities. Merchants came and went. Soldiers were transferred. Officials traveled. The population of commercial centers could change constantly. This movement was good for business. But it could make personal relationships less predictable. Trust therefore had economic value. People remembered reliable customers. They remembered dishonest ones. They remembered safe places. They remembered dangerous streets. They remembered people who could be trusted with information. In a world without modern databases or communication networks, memory and reputation became practical tools of survival. For prostitutes, such informal knowledge could be especially important. The occupation depended upon dealing with strangers, but survival depended upon identifying which strangers were safer than others. Still, no amount of experience could eliminate every risk. This was especially true for physical health. The ancient world had no modern understanding of sexually transmitted infections. People recognized symptoms and possessed traditional treatments, but they could not identify microorganisms or prevent transmission with modern medical knowledge. Illness could therefore spread silently. For prostitutes, repeated sexual contact could create health risks that were difficult to understand fully. Pregnancy created another danger. Ancient women possessed knowledge of fertility, pregnancy, and childbirth, but childbirth itself could be dangerous. There were no modern obstetric procedures. No antibiotics for severe infections. No blood transfusions. No modern emergency surgery. A difficult birth could become fatal. For a woman already living in poverty, the consequences could extend beyond health. Pregnancy could interrupt income. A newborn required constant care. Food and clothing became additional expenses. If there was no supportive family, the pressure increased. Yet it is important not to reduce ancient women to helpless victims. Women possessed knowledge. They built relationships. They worked. They negotiated. They managed households. They raised children. They participated in economic life. Some possessed property or resources. Some were able to make decisions that affected their families. Even within restrictive circumstances, people found ways to exercise agency. A prostitute could negotiate a payment, refuse a particular customer, choose where to work, build relationships with regular clients, save money when possible, seek assistance from relatives, move to another neighborhood, or leave the occupation entirely if circumstances allowed. But agency did not mean complete freedom. A poor person could make decisions within narrow limits. The difference matters. Freedom is not simply the ability to choose. It is also the ability to survive the consequences of refusing one option. If refusing a customer meant going hungry, the practical freedom to refuse was reduced. If leaving an intermediary meant losing housing, independence became difficult. If another occupation paid too little to support a child, changing jobs might not be realistic. This was the economic pressure behind many difficult occupations throughout history. The choices were real, but the alternatives could be harsh. For this reason, the story of prostitution in ancient Persia should not be romanticized. There was no reason to imagine the occupation as glamorous. Nor should it be described as nothing but misery. The historical reality was probably varied. Some women may have experienced severe exploitation. Others may have had greater independence. Some may have entered temporarily. Others may have remained longer. Some may have had supportive relationships. Others may have been isolated. The evidence cannot tell us exactly how common each experience was. What can be understood is the environment in which these lives unfolded. It was a world where money mattered greatly. Family mattered. Reputation mattered. Power mattered. And protection was often connected to social relationships. As the night grew darker, the importance of these relationships became even clearer. A person returning home needed somewhere safe to sleep. A person carrying money needed to protect it. A person who had been threatened needed someone to trust. A person who became sick needed help. And a person who had been exploited needed some form of protection that might not always be available. This uncertainty was one of the hardest realities of ancient life. The law existed. The authorities existed. The community existed. But none could guarantee safety at every moment. For the poorest people, survival often depended upon a combination of caution, experience. Evening in ancient Persia. Returning through the city as the sun disappears. The heat of the day had finally begun to fade. Across the Persian city, the long shadows of buildings stretched farther into the streets. The bright light that had filled the marketplace softened into the warm colors of evening, and one by one, merchants began gathering the goods that remained unsold. The working day was coming to an end. For a prostitute, returning through the city after hours of work meant leaving behind the crowded commercial world and entering the quieter rhythm of evening. The streets were changing. The loudest voices had disappeared. Animals were being led back toward their enclosures. Workers carried the last loads of the day. Shopkeepers counted their money. Travelers searched for somewhere to eat and sleep. And households prepared for the night. Ancient cities did not become completely silent after sunset. They simply changed their rhythm. During daylight, economic activity dominated the streets. At night, the household became more important. Cooking fires were tended. Food was shared. Water was stored. Children were settled. Clothing was folded. Tools were put away. The ordinary work of living continued behind walls. For someone who had spent the day working among strangers, this transition could create a noticeable difference. The marketplace was public. The home was private. The street exposed a person to countless unfamiliar faces. A room offered a small measure of separation from the outside world. Even a modest dwelling could provide a place where the noise of the city became distant. Of course, not every prostitute possessed a comfortable private home. Housing depended upon wealth. Some people lived in larger family compounds. Others lived in modest rooms. Some shared accommodation. Travelers might sleep in temporary lodging. Poor workers could live in crowded conditions. The ancient city contained many different standards of living. The wealthy could surround themselves with servants, courtyards, fine textiles, storage rooms, and comfortable furniture. The poor might have little more than sleeping mats, simple vessels, basic clothing, and a few possessions. A person's living space therefore reflected economic circumstances. For someone living near poverty, returning home did not necessarily mean entering luxury. It meant entering a place where the necessities of life were kept. A clay vessel for water, a container for grain, cooking equipment, a sleeping mat, perhaps a few household tools, perhaps clothing folded carefully against a wall. Every object had practical value. Nothing needed to be decorative to be important. The evening meal was another reminder of economic position. Food varied enormously across the Persian Empire. The empire stretched through regions with different climates and agricultural traditions, so people ate what their local environment and economic circumstances allowed. Grain was fundamental. Bread and other grain-based foods could form the basis of ordinary meals. Legumes, onions, herbs, fruits, dates, dairy products, and other foods supplemented the diet. Meat was available, but regular consumption depended heavily upon wealth and location. A poor household might rely upon inexpensive staples. A wealthy household could afford greater variety. For a prostitute who had earned money during the day, deciding what to purchase was part of the evening routine. A few coins could become food. Food could become energy. Energy would become another day's work. This simple chain connected the entire day. The morning preparation had made work possible. The afternoon work had produced income. The evening income now had to become food and shelter. And the next morning would begin the cycle again. This was the rhythm of life for many people living close to subsistence. Money came in. Necessities consumed it. Little remained. The ancient economy could therefore feel endless. There was always another expense waiting. Clothing wore out. Food had to be replaced. Water had to be collected. Tools needed repair. Housing needed maintenance. An illness could create unexpected costs. Still, evening could bring moments of peace. The human need for rest existed in every social class. A royal household might rest in a magnificent palace. A poor worker might rest on a simple woven mat. The surroundings were different. The basic need was the same. After a long day, the body needed stillness. This was especially true in a world where work was physically demanding. Walking through dusty streets, carrying water, preparing food, standing for long periods, working in workshops, farming, building, transporting goods. All of these activities required physical effort. Even people whose work appeared less strenuous were living without the conveniences of modern life. There were no electric lights, no refrigeration, no running water in the modern sense, no machines to perform ordinary household tasks. Night therefore arrived with a real change in daily possibilities. Once the sun disappeared, artificial light became limited and valuable. Oil lamps could provide illumination, but fuel had to be obtained. Light could not simply be switched on. A household had to decide when lighting was worth the expense. For poor families, unnecessary illumination could mean wasted resources. The night also changed movement through the city. Streets that were busy during daylight became more difficult to navigate. Darkness reduced visibility. People had to rely upon familiarity with the neighborhood. This was another reason that the home mattered. Returning before the streets became too dark could be practical. For those who worked into the evening, familiarity with routes and people could provide a degree of security. The ancient city was not uniformly dangerous at night. But darkness naturally reduced visibility and increased uncertainty. A person traveling alone had fewer ways to call for assistance. There were no telephones. No streetlights stretching across every road. No emergency services. Safety depended heavily upon circumstances. This made the return journey an important part of the day. The city itself seemed different after sunset. The marketplace was quieter. The smells of cooking became stronger. Smoke rose from household fires. Voices carried farther through narrow streets. Animals settled down. Doors closed. Families gathered. And the great commercial machine of the daytime slowed into a quieter domestic rhythm. For someone living outside a conventional family structure, this transformation could have another meaning. The city was full of families. Everywhere there were signs of household life. Parents preparing food. Children playing before bedtime. Relatives speaking together. Neighbors visiting. These ordinary scenes could emphasize the difference between belonging to a household and living independently. But loneliness should not automatically be assumed. A person living alone could have friendships. A prostitute could have relatives. A worker could have neighbors. A person outside conventional marriage could still possess strong relationships. Ancient people were not defined only by official social categories. They formed friendships, alliances, partnerships, and communities. The historical record simply does not preserve most of them. This is especially true for marginalized people. The names of kings survived. The names of generals survived. The names of some wealthy merchants survived. But countless ordinary workers disappeared from the written record. Their lives continued nonetheless. They ate. They laughed. They became tired. They worried. They planned. They remembered. And they slept. This is one reason an ordinary evening can tell us so much about ancient history. There was no great battle. No royal ceremony. No monumental construction. Just a person returning through a city at sunset. Yet that quiet journey contained the essential realities of life. Work had been done. Money had been earned. Food had to be obtained. The body needed rest. Tomorrow would bring another day. As the final light disappeared from the walls, the streets became darker. The city settled into night. A few voices remained. A few lamps continued burning. Some travelers were still awake. Some households were still eating. But for many workers, the day's responsibilities were ending. The road home had reached its conclusion. And now came the simplest part of the day. Eating. Resting. Speaking with whoever might be nearby. And allowing the exhaustion of the day's work to slowly disappear. The ancient Persian night had arrived. And within its quietness, another ordinary human story was taking place, one that history rarely recorded, but one that was repeated night after night across the empire. Food, conversation, neighbors, and quiet reflection. The night had now settled over the Persian city. The streets were darker, quieter, and cooler than they had been only a few hours earlier. The noise of commerce had almost disappeared, replaced by the smaller sounds of domestic life. Inside modest homes, evening meals were being finished. Clay vessels were moved aside. Water was poured. Children were prepared for sleep. People spoke about the day's work. For someone living through prostitution, the evening could offer a brief separation from the demands of the marketplace. The work was finished, at least for the moment. There was no customer to negotiate with. No payment to discuss. No crowded street to cross. There was simply the ordinary task of getting through another evening. Food came first. A modest meal did not need to be elaborate. Bread or another grain-based food could provide the foundation. Depending on location and means, There might also be lentils, beans, onions, herbs, dates, fruit, dairy products, or other locally available foods. The wealthier members of Persian society could enjoy much greater variety. Fine households could obtain better ingredients and employ people to prepare them. Poor households had to work with what was affordable. This difference was visible in almost every part of ancient life. A wealthy person could eat for pleasure. A poor person often had to eat for energy. The purpose of the meal was simple. There had to be enough strength for tomorrow. After food came the small domestic tasks that filled the evening. Vessels needed to be cleaned. Remaining food needed to be stored. Clothing might need to be folded or repaired. Water containers needed to be positioned for the morning. A lamp might be extinguished once there was no longer any work requiring light. None of these activities were historically dramatic. Yet they were the foundation of everyday life. Civilizations are often remembered through palaces and monuments, but ordinary people experience civilization through much smaller things. A loaf of bread. A clay jar. A woven garment. A sleeping mat. A cooking fire. A doorway. These objects were part of the physical world in which people lived. For a poor household, possessions were often limited. That did not necessarily mean the room felt empty. The few objects present could have considerable value. A good cooking vessel could last for years. A well-made textile could be repaired repeatedly. A storage jar could protect food or water. A simple tool could make daily work easier. People learned to maintain what they owned because replacing it was expensive. This was one of the differences between ancient and modern life. Modern households can often replace broken objects quickly. Ancient households had to repair them. A torn garment could be stitched. A damaged basket could be repaired. A cracked vessel might be discarded only when it became impossible to use. Every object represented labor. Someone had gathered the material. Someone had shaped it. Someone had transported it. Someone had traded it. Someone had paid for it. This gave ordinary possessions a significance that is easy to overlook. After the meal, conversation could provide another form of comfort. Ancient people, like people everywhere, had stories to tell. A neighbor might discuss the marketplace. A traveler might describe another city. A merchant might complain about prices. A farmer might talk about the harvest. Someone might mention a wedding. Someone else might speak about a relative. People could discuss politics, religion, work, weather, food, or rumors. Not every conversation was serious. Much of ordinary life was probably filled with humor, complaints, teasing, and stories that disappeared as soon as they were spoken. This is another part of history that rarely survives. Historians can reconstruct administrative systems. They can study monuments. They can analyze archaeological remains. But they cannot recover most of the jokes shared between ordinary people at the end of a working day. They cannot hear the conversations around ancient cooking fires. They cannot know exactly what a poor woman whispered to a neighbor before sleeping. These moments disappeared with the people who experienced them. Yet they mattered. For someone living a difficult life, conversation could provide a sense of belonging. A neighbor might become familiar. A friendship might develop. Two workers might share information. People might exchange advice about prices, landlords, customers, employment, or local events. In a world without modern communication, these personal networks were extremely valuable. Information traveled through people. If a new opportunity appeared, someone had to hear about it and tell another person. If a particular merchant was dishonest, others could be warned. If a landlord was fair, people could recommend the accommodation. If a traveler was looking for services, news could spread through the neighborhood. Community knowledge could therefore function as a form of protection. But community could also bring judgment. The same neighbors who offered advice could notice unusual behavior. They could notice visitors. They could notice changes in clothing. They could notice when someone returned late. They could talk about what they saw. This was especially important for someone involved in prostitution. Privacy was difficult to maintain in a tightly connected neighborhood. The occupation might be known. It might be suspected. Or it might simply be ignored as long as it did not disturb the community. Different people would react differently. Some might disapprove. Some might remain indifferent. Some might quietly depend upon the income. Some might offer sympathy. Some might exploit the situation. There was no single response. This uncertainty could make social life complicated. A prostitute might have to live with the knowledge that other people were forming opinions. Yet social judgment did not necessarily define every relationship. A neighbor could still lend water. Someone could still share food. A familiar person could still offer help. Human relationships are rarely governed entirely by social categories. People can criticize a person's occupation while still caring about the individual. They can disagree morally while maintaining friendship. They can depend upon someone they publicly disapprove of. Ancient communities were made of people, not abstract rules. And people were complicated. As the evening grew later, the city became quieter. The last conversations faded. The number of lamps decreased. The temperature dropped. The day's physical exhaustion became more noticeable. For someone who had spent hours working, tiredness could be overwhelming. There was little need for entertainment. There were no screens. No television. No endless stream of digital information. Night naturally encouraged rest. A person might speak briefly with a neighbor, prepare clothing for the morning, and then lie down. Sleep was essential. The next day would require the same body that had already worked through today. This was particularly important for poor workers. Rest was not simply relaxation. It was preparation for another day's labor. The ancient world could be physically exhausting because so much depended upon human effort. Water had to be carried. Food had to be prepared. Goods had to be moved. Clothing had to be maintained. Buildings had to be repaired. Travel had to be completed on foot or with animals. Everyday survival required physical participation. The body was therefore one of the most important possessions a poor person had. Keeping it healthy mattered. And yet keeping healthy was not always possible. There were illnesses. There were injuries. There were pregnancies. There were difficult births. There were periods when food was scarce. There were days when work could not be avoided despite exhaustion. This made the peaceful moments of evening valuable. For a few hours, there was nothing that needed to be negotiated. Nothing needed to be sold. Nothing needed to be carried. Nothing needed to be explained. There was only rest. Perhaps there was a small hope that tomorrow would be better. Perhaps there was a worry that tomorrow would be worse. Perhaps there was simply acceptance of another ordinary day. We cannot know the private thoughts of an individual prostitute in ancient Persia. No surviving record tells us exactly what such a person thought while lying down at night. It would be wrong to invent those thoughts as historical fact. But the circumstances allow us to understand the possibilities. There may have been concern about money. There may have been thoughts about family. There may have been worries about reputation. There may have been plans for leaving the occupation. There may have been no larger plan at all. Sometimes survival leaves little room for long-term dreams. A person may simply focus on the next morning, and the next meal, and the next payment, and the next place to sleep. This was one of the quiet burdens of poverty. The future was difficult to imagine when the present demanded constant attention. Yet people still dreamed. Even in difficult circumstances, human beings imagined different possibilities. A better home, more money, a supportive family, a safer life, a different occupation, a chance to leave the city, or simply enough security to stop worrying about tomorrow. Such hopes may never have been written down, but they belong to ordinary human life. Outside, the Persian city was almost completely dark. The marketplace was empty. The roads were quiet. The great empire continued beyond the walls, stretching across mountains, plains, deserts. The life that history forgot. Leaving the occupation, growing older, and searching for another life. Morning eventually returned to the Persian city. The darkness disappeared slowly as the first light reached the rooftops and walls. Before long, the sounds of ordinary life began again. Doors opened. Animals stirred. Cooking fires were prepared. Workers began moving through the streets. The marketplace slowly returned to life. For a prostitute, another day could begin exactly like the previous one. But human lives were never perfectly repetitive. Circumstances changed. People became older. Families changed. Children grew. Money was gained and lost. Relationships appeared and disappeared. And sometimes a person found a way to leave an occupation that had once seemed unavoidable. The ancient evidence does not tell us how often prostitutes in Persian society left their work. There is no reliable record showing a standard retirement age or a universal path into another occupation. It would therefore be misleading to invent one. But prostitution, like other forms of labor, was not necessarily a permanent identity. People changed occupations throughout the ancient world. A worker could move from one type of employment to another. A servant could become independent. A laborer could learn a craft. A widow could enter paid work. A person could move to another city. Marriage could change economic circumstances. Family support could change. Children could become old enough to contribute. A financial opportunity could appear unexpectedly. Life could move in a new direction. For someone involved in prostitution, leaving the occupation could depend upon having alternatives. Perhaps there was family support. Perhaps there was enough money saved. Perhaps another occupation became available. Perhaps a marriage provided a new household. Perhaps circumstances forced a move. The possibilities were many. But the obstacles were also real. Skills mattered. Connections mattered. Money mattered. Reputation mattered. A person who had spent years working outside respectable occupations might face difficulty entering another part of society. Social judgment could follow. Yet reputation was not always permanent. Cities changed. People moved. New generations appeared. A person could sometimes begin again somewhere else. The enormous size of the Persian Empire created opportunities for movement. The empire connected distant regions through roads, administrative systems, trade routes, and military networks. People traveled. Merchants moved between cities. Workers were relocated. Soldiers traveled with armies. Officials were transferred. Families migrated. Movement was therefore part of ancient imperial life. For someone wishing to escape an old reputation, another city could potentially offer anonymity. But travel required resources. A person needed money, a safe route, food, a place to stay, and some reason for the journey. Travel could also be dangerous. Roads were long. Distances were enormous. Weather could be harsh. Banditry existed. Not every traveler reached their destination easily. For a poor woman, leaving one city for another was therefore not a simple decision. The familiar dangers of one place could sometimes seem preferable to the unknown dangers of another. This is another way poverty limited choice. The wealthy could travel more easily. They could hire transport. They could bring servants. They could carry supplies. The poor had fewer options. A person might therefore remain in a difficult environment simply because leaving was too expensive. The occupation itself could also create relationships. Regular customers might become familiar. Neighbors might become accustomed to the person. An intermediary might provide work. Even an imperfect arrangement could provide predictability. Leaving meant abandoning that predictability. This could be frightening. Human beings often remain in difficult circumstances because the alternative is uncertain. The ancient world offered many examples of this. A farmer might remain on poor land because moving required money. A laborer might remain with an employer because finding another job was uncertain. A debtor might remain dependent because repayment was impossible. A prostitute might remain in the occupation because other options were less reliable. This does not mean that the person had no agency. It means that agency operated within circumstances. Every decision was made against a background of available choices. And choices were shaped by wealth, family, health, social status, and opportunity. Age could change those calculations. A younger worker might have greater physical ability. An older worker might find certain forms of labor more difficult. But age could also bring experience. Knowledge of the city. Knowledge of people. Knowledge of business. Knowledge of customers. Knowledge of dangers. Experience could become a form of protection. A person who had survived years of uncertainty might understand the local economy better than a newcomer. That knowledge could help with bargaining. It could help identify dishonest people. It could help find safer accommodation. It could help build relationships. Experience could therefore compensate for some disadvantages. But physical aging remained unavoidable. The body could not work forever at the same level. Ancient life was physically demanding, and many people experienced serious health problems long before what modern societies consider old age. For a prostitute, this could make the question of long-term survival especially important. If daily income depended heavily upon physical work, what happened when the body became less capable? Family could become essential. Savings could become essential. Other forms of work could become essential. But not everyone had these resources. Some people probably remained economically vulnerable throughout their lives. This was not unique to prostitution. Ancient workers in many occupations could reach old age without meaningful financial security. Farmers could lose their land. Laborers could become unable to work. Servants could lose their position. Widows could face poverty. People could become dependent upon relatives. The ancient world offered few guarantees. This makes the idea of retirement misleading when applied to many ordinary people. There was no universal system that allowed workers to stop working at a particular age and receive an income. People generally depended upon family, savings, property, charity, continued labor, or some combination of these. For a poor prostitute, the future could therefore be uncertain. Yet there were other possibilities. Some might have accumulated enough money to establish another livelihood. Perhaps a small food business. Perhaps textile production. Perhaps household work. Perhaps trade on a small scale. Perhaps assistance to younger family members. The historical record cannot tell us how often such transitions occurred. But ancient women did participate in many kinds of economic activity. The administrative evidence from the Persian period demonstrates that women could work and receive economic resources. This broader context makes it possible to understand that prostitution was only one part of a much larger economic world. A woman's economic life could change. The identity assigned to her by others could also change. A person known in one neighborhood might become unknown in another. A young woman could become a mother. A married woman could become a widow. A poor worker could become more prosperous. A person could fall from prosperity into poverty. Ancient life was not fixed. People moved through different roles. The difficulty is that history usually records these changes only for people important enough to appear in surviving documents. The lives of ordinary marginalized women rarely received such attention. Their stories disappeared. Their names disappeared. Their conversations disappeared. Their fears disappeared. Their small victories disappeared. And yet those lives were part of the civilization. The Persian Empire could not function without ordinary people. The roads required workers. The farms required labor. The workshops required craftsmen. The households required servants and producers. The marketplaces required merchants and customers. And the cities depended upon countless services that rarely appeared in royal inscriptions. Prostitutes were part of this invisible economic world. Their work may have been stigmatized. Their lives may have been difficult. Their names may have been forgotten. But they existed within the same streets as merchants, soldiers, farmers, officials, and aristocrats. They watched the same sun rise. They walked beneath the same city walls. They heard the same marketplace noise. They experienced the same seasons. They worried about the same basic needs. And they grew older beneath the same Persian sky. Perhaps the most important lesson is that history should not be measured only by what survives in monuments. A palace tells us about kings. A royal inscription tells us about rulers. A temple tells us about religious institutions. But none of these alone can explain how ordinary people experienced an ordinary day. For that, we must look toward the margins. Toward workers. Toward families. Toward people whose names were never carved into stone. The life of a prostitute in ancient Persia belonged to that forgotten majority. A life shaped by economic necessity. A life influenced by social judgment. A life surrounded by uncertainty. A life that could contain danger, but also ordinary moments of work, food, conversation, rest, and survival. What history remembers, what it lost, and the end of the day. The Persian city was awake again. Another morning had arrived, and with it came the familiar sounds of work. Doors opened. Animals moved through the streets. Merchants prepared their goods. Workers began their daily tasks. Somewhere among them were people whose names would never appear in the great histories of the Persian Empire. Their lives would leave no royal inscription. No monument would be built in their memory. No historian would carefully record what they ate for breakfast, whom they spoke with, what they feared, or what they hoped would happen tomorrow. This is the great difficulty of studying ordinary people in the ancient world. History has preserved the voices of the powerful far more effectively than the voices of the poor. Kings left inscriptions. Governments created administrative records. Wealthy families could preserve documents. Religious institutions maintained traditions. But ordinary workers often left behind almost nothing. This is particularly true of marginalized women. Their lives are frequently visible only indirectly. A record might mention a payment. An administrative document might record a worker. A legal text might reveal a dispute. Archaeology might reveal the environment in which people lived. But behind each fragment was a human being. And the human being is often missing from the record. This is why it is important to be careful when discussing prostitution in ancient Persia. There is a temptation to tell a dramatic story and present every detail as certain. But the evidence does not allow that. The Persian Empire was enormous. It lasted for centuries. Its people belonged to different cultures and communities. Practices could change across time. What happened in one city did not necessarily happen in another. What was normal for one social class could be unusual for another. And the surviving evidence is incomplete. So the most honest historical story is not one that pretends to know everything. It is one that recognizes the limits of knowledge. We can say that prostitution existed in the ancient Near Eastern world. We can examine the economic and social conditions surrounding sexual labor. We can study women's participation in Persian economic life. We can understand the importance of marriage, family, reputation, and social status. We can examine the dangers created by poverty and dependence. But we cannot confidently describe the private thoughts of one particular prostitute from ancient Persia. We cannot know exactly what every customer expected. We cannot know how every woman entered the occupation. We cannot know how many eventually left it. And we cannot assume that every experience was the same. The uncertainty does not make the subject meaningless. In fact, it makes the ordinary details more important. A clay vessel, a woven garment, a small payment, a rented room, a meal at the end of the day, a conversation with a neighbor. These fragments can tell us about the environment in which marginalized people lived. They remind us that ancient history was not made only by rulers. It was also made by workers, by farmers, by craftsmen, by servants, by merchants, by mothers, by children, by travelers, and by people living at the edges of respectable society. The Persian Empire was one of the largest political systems of the ancient world. Its roads connected distant regions. Its administrators managed enormous territories. Its armies moved across continents. Its rulers commanded extraordinary resources. But all of that depended upon ordinary people. Someone had to grow the grain. Someone had to transport it. Someone had to prepare food. Someone had to weave textiles. Someone had to build houses. Someone had to care for animals. Someone had to serve travelers. Someone had to maintain the cities. The empire was built upon millions of small acts of labor. Prostitution, wherever and however it was practiced, existed within this broader economy. It was not a separate world. Its customers came from society. Its money moved through society. Its workers lived among society. And the people involved were affected by the same forces that affected everyone else. Food prices, housing, family, illness, debt, travel, war, trade, social reputation, economic opportunity. These forces could shape a person's life just as strongly as the occupation itself. For a poor woman, the most important question might not have been what society thought about her. It might simply have been whether there would be enough food tomorrow. That is one of the realities easily lost when history focuses too heavily on morality. A person living in poverty may not have had the luxury of making decisions entirely according to social ideals. Survival could come first. Yet survival does not erase dignity. A person working in a stigmatized occupation remained a person. There could be friendships. There could be affection. There could be humor. There could be personal pride. There could be disappointment. There could be ambition. There could be fear. There could even be moments of happiness. Ancient people were not simply victims of their circumstances. They adapted. They negotiated. They built relationships. They protected what they could. They made choices. They tried to create better futures. Some succeeded. Others did not. Most disappeared from history without leaving enough evidence for us to know which path they followed. Perhaps that is the saddest part of the story. Not that the ancient world was difficult. It certainly was. Not that prostitution could involve exploitation. It could. Not that poverty could be brutal. It often was. The saddest part is that so many people lived entire lives without leaving behind enough evidence for later generations to know that they had existed. A person could work for decades, raise children, feed a family, survive illness, walk thousands of streets, meet hundreds of people, and then disappear almost completely from historical memory. No inscription would mention the work. No monument would describe the struggle. No official record would explain the private emotions. Only fragments might remain. Perhaps a document. Perhaps an object. Perhaps the remains of a building. Perhaps nothing at all. Yet absence from history does not mean absence from the past. Every forgotten person was once present. Every forgotten worker once occupied space. Every forgotten woman once had a voice. Every forgotten household once had a morning. And every forgotten night eventually became another forgotten morning. This is why the story of an ordinary prostitute in Persian civilization should not be treated merely as a story about sex. It is a story about economics. It is a story about women. It is a story about inequality. It is a story about family. It is a story about reputation. It is a story about survival. And above all, it is a story about the people who existed beneath the level of kings and monuments. The Persian Empire is often remembered through grand images. Persepolis. Royal processions. Immense palaces. Kings seated upon thrones. Soldiers marching beneath imperial banners. But beyond those images was another Persia. A quieter Persia. A Persia of kitchens and workshops. Of farms and marketplaces. Of rented rooms and crowded streets. Of poor households and tired workers. Of people counting small amounts of money at the end of the day. That Persia was just as real as the Persia of kings. And for most people, it was the Persia they actually knew. As evening eventually returned once more, the city began its familiar transformation. The marketplace became quieter. The sunlight faded. Cooking fires appeared behind walls. People returned to their homes. The street slowly emptied. Another day had passed. For some, it had been profitable. For others, disappointing. For some, dangerous. For others, ordinary. But for nearly everyone, tomorrow would require beginning again. The ancient world had no promise that life would become easier. There was only the possibility of another morning, another meal, another day's work, another chance to earn enough, another chance to survive. And somewhere within that enormous Persian civilization, another ordinary person would lie down beneath the darkness of the ancient sky. History would not remember the name. It would not remember the face. It would not remember the voice. But for one lifetime, that person had existed, had worked, had endured, had hoped, had lived. And perhaps that is enough reason to remember. Not as a legend. Not as a stereotype. Not as a symbol. But simply as one human life among millions that once made the Persian world what it was. The city slept. The lamps went dark. The streets became still. And the story, like so many forgotten lives of the ancient world, quietly disappeared into the night.